You so much, and welcome to the seventh session on policy lessons in inclusive education. We have four fantastic presentations for you today. We're going to have presentations on actions for reducing inequalities in education. It's going to be a comparative report for Albania, Bosnia and Herzegovina, North Macedonia, Kosovo, Serbia, and Turkey. We've also got a presentation on all means all in inclusion and education. We have another presentation on the development of inclusive education in the Ukraine, and then we have a fourth presentation in Russian. And I'm going to I'm not going to even attempt to translate that for you, but we're going to have a very good session today. What I would like to do is that each session is going to be 15 minutes long, okay? If you have questions, we're going to have 5 minutes after the presentations for question. But if you would like to write your questions in the chat box as we're going through the presentations, you would find that very, very useful. Sorry, the last presentation is not actually going ahead, okay? The last presentation is not going ahead. So we've got three presentations. We've got Ivana Cenerić, we've got Lana Jurko, and we have Sergiy Londar, who are going to be presenting for us today. Okay, so please put your questions in the chat, and what we'll do is we'll go through the questions in the chat first, and then we will open if we've got time after the 5 minutes, before the 5 minutes runs out, to take any additional questions that we may have. Okay, so now I would like to offer the floor to Ivana Cenerić for the first presentation.
Thank you, Andie, and thank you to all the participants who showed interest in this topic. And I hope that I will just tickle your brain about this report, because we have very short time. So I will just give you this brief presentation, but report is available online, as well as all the country policy briefs and national reports. So in the final slide, you will find links to all the materials. The first important thing that I want to mention is that this report is only part of the RISE project that was implemented in order to reinforce the capacity of civil society organizations in identifying needs and proposing data-driven solutions for some of the main challenges in their country. So it's very tailor-made and country-specific. And this comparative report was produced to be a part of their tools to advocate for certain solutions, to maybe do some further research on some issues that they discovered after reading this report, or maybe to use it for promotion of some good practices. Before I start with the presentation of the report, I need to mention that other than the authors that are listed as the authors of the report, we especially have to thank all the national researchers from all the countries, because they did a tremendous work with answering very comprehensive questionnaires on their national policies, conducting field research, numerous focus groups and interviews. So they are also a very big part of this report, and it wouldn't be possible without them. To briefly present how our idea of the structure of the report goes is, we were wondering how is equity actually defined in national context and in legislation, because we during many years of experience realized that the way that we talk about things defines very much how we approach specific issues. So we were interested, is equity defined in national legislation, how it is defined, and is it defined in education laws or only in some specific areas? Then we looked further and more closely to equity in education and barriers for students, focusing mostly on poverty as one of the underlying causes for many barriers. Many barriers kind of have their consequences displayed differently, but the root cause is usually poverty and low socioeconomic status. And then we provide some main conclusions and recommendations that are collected from all countries, and show some good practices, how some countries implemented some of those policies. Looking through national legislation, needless to say that all the countries are signatories of some binding commitments or conventions. So they all include equity very high on their policy agenda. It is in their national constitutions, it is in umbrella laws. It is always a cross-cutting issue topic. It is present in education laws. and so on and so on. But the way how we approach it is a bit different, because we cannot really clearly say how equity is defined, but we usually turn to defining what is discrimination. So most legislation and most laws actually prohibit discrimination. And when we go to that approach, we might fall into a trap, because when you start to list all the categories or all the criteria based on which somebody or something cannot be discriminated, you try to make comprehensive list, but you always forget something, or there is always something that is new, or that is not recognized by one community and it is recognized by another community. So it is a very tricky area to define equity in terms of prohibition of discrimination. But that is usually what we find in national legislation. Also, the criteria for disadvantaged groups are similar, but they differ, as you can see in some countries. Those who are at risk at poverty are recognized. There are more recognized groups in some countries, in some there are less, but usually the way that legal framework identifies them then decides on the measures and policies that will be implemented as a support. So if the national if the list of disadvantaged groups is not comprehensive enough, then some of them are left out, and the policies, support policies, do not cover them. What else emerged as an issue is that even when we have really good quality policies and really well elaborated tools and instruments of support, they are not implemented well in practice, and that shows in education when we look at some data mostly about enrollment, about access, about achievement of specific groups. And here are just some snapshots about on differences in enrollment of some disadvantaged groups in some countries. And you can see that the similarity is that always students from poor households or from migrant backgrounds have limited access and enroll in smaller percentage in compulsory education, and even less in preschool education than those from the general population. As I mentioned, we specifically focused on poverty as one of the main issues, and we explored how much low socioeconomic status has an effect on school achievement. And as you can see, the significant percentage of variance in achievement is explained by socioeconomic status, and which is something that we already know. But what was interesting to see is in some countries, like in Serbia and North Macedonia, there is a very high proportion of disadvantaged students in same schools. So now we have clusters of schools with low performing students that are usually in poor areas. So you have that vicious cycles of students going to schools that are in municipalities that cannot support them materially. They are already materially deprived. And then you have kind of those centralized need for support, which is not usually recognized in national policies if they're highly centralized. So they cannot direct funds efficiently to those that are in need. Our stakeholders on the field, I mean, national researchers collected their opinions, usually say that the main problem in implementation of any policy and support measure is that there is not enough enforcement mechanisms. So you cannot hire enough inspection or enough control to make sure that in each school everywhere is implemented correctly. So usually they say that we like enforcement mechanisms, that there is also not enough time usually invested in creating professional capacity of people in school to implement those policies. So reforms usually either go too fast, so new things are implemented, or too slow because they do not reach all the participants in the process. So they usually stick to 20-30% of teachers in big cities, or teachers that have approached better access to professional development, so that they don't again reach the ones that are most in need. The other thing is also that sometimes policies are too fragmented, so they are only focused on compulsory levels of education, and then if children are supported in primary school, if secondary is not compulsory, they cannot get the same type of support. So that is also present in some countries, that there are no there is no continuity in that kind of support. We try to kind of separate barriers that students face in each country, and we divided them into barriers related to access, barriers in attainment, and barriers in progression. Why? Because it was in all legislation, access is always guaranteed to everybody. I mean, it as prescribed by the Constitution and by law, it is accessible for everybody. It is usually compulsory education free of charge, but that doesn't really mean that it is available to everybody, because even if education is free of charge, there are still a lot of hidden costs. So those hidden costs usually present big barrier to access, because even if you don't pay anything to get enrolled, if you don't get clothes, or if you don't have shoes to walk to school, or if you don't have transportation, then the school is again out of your limit, in the same way as if it wasn't free. Barriers in attainment actually are focused exactly what I said in targeting measures. So some measures are not properly targeted. So even if a child from poor family enters school, they maybe do not exercise all their rights. So they don't receive all the necessary support, because school cannot provide them throughout the whole education, school textbooks, clothes, textbooks, meals, and everything. It depends sometimes on the possibilities within the municipality. Sometimes it is guaranteed on the national level, but it is not uniform. So all countries face this problem. If these responsibilities for providing this support are on local level, there are differences between municipalities. If these are responsibilities of the state, then they are usually not sensitive enough to reach every school and every child. So there is always that problem, and that usually leads to dropout. Regarding barriers in progression, other those things that we mentioned already, there is also the way that our progression policy is set. Like, how can you go to another education level if there are high exam tests, if there is too many private tutoring, and poor students cannot really rely on the additional support during their school, so they cannot prepare for those high stake exams to go to another level of education. So those are like all the things that cannot be prescribed by the one law, but are part of the strategic approach, and how do we actually define equity, whether it is like we are going to allow everybody to have the same, or we are going to remove those barriers that are actually making inequalities in the system. Those are kind of like three main parts, but also the education system on its own can have some internal flaws that can cause barriers. One is equity in education financing. Mostly in all countries, majority of education budget, which is always very small, it is never enough, but even that small amount of money that is allocated for education goes to teacher salaries. Very little remains for any kind of developmental projects or to support the students. And usually all the education budget kind of goes only for keeping the current condition. It is really only way to secure funds for some kind of reforms or improvement is through projects, donations, loans, and so on and so on. The other part is how the school network is organized. So sometimes school network has stayed the same over many decades, and the demographics have changed, the needs of the population have changed, but the school network remained the same. So many areas now are left without secondary schools. Some municipalities got a lot of new citizens, but they don't have enough rooms in kindergartens, in schools. So basically the point is that school network has to follow those changes in demographics and in the needs of the population. Policy coordination among sectors is a weak link in all countries, especially between social welfare and health, because kinds of the education, social welfare, and health are very interrelated. The first kind of institution where the child goes is usually health, I mean, to pediatrician, to the health center, and poor families usually go to social welfare centers, and they all have different datas, and they all know the same family, but kind of there is no exchange in information. And by the time the child is in school, the school could have much more information on the family and could have much better insight on the needs of specific families. But usually those three sectors are very poorly coordinated, and there is no unified databases. Lack of timely and accessible information refers to the fact that, you know, even if you have support measures, not everybody are competent in the same manner to exercise their rights. So information has to be, you know, found in different places. It has to be delivered different to different families. It needs to be also supported in some way. So families need to have somebody that will guide them through usually very complicated administrative procedures. And that is all the reason why some families never actually get the support that they need. I only highlighted here that indirect discrimination is also often present because, as I said, we define some forms of discrimination, but some remain invisible. And that is visible in education systems when you go in schools, and then you realize that there are some relics of some stereotypes or some traditional opinions that kind of, you know, became like they're normal, but they are still discriminatory against some groups. Policies and practices that we found that promote equity is basically the other side of those problems that I just mentioned. So targeted and continuous support. Continuous is very important to follow the child from preschool to the end of its educational path. Flexible educational content and inclusion in the curriculum. Supplementary classes are available usually on paper, but they are not used enough, which we can see from large scale of private tutoring that is present in all countries. Professional development of teachers is must needed if we want to implement all the fast-paced reforms. Teachers need to get professional development in the same pace, because initial teacher education is more difficult to change so quickly and to compensate for all the missing competencies. But good professional development is where we can fill in the gaps. Creating inclusive school environment is not only making school inclusive in terms of opening it to all the students, but it is also connecting with the community and kind of involving the different stakeholders that are not maybe usually school partners, you know, like other NGOs and institutions. And of course, what is completely self-evident, material support has to be provided to all the students, because before the satisfaction of basic needs, we cannot really deal with the higher needs or expect from students and families to be invested in education. Two parts that we specifically wanted to highlight is education of students with special education needs. The trend is to have those students in regular schools, and that is something that we are all aiming for. But some countries progress more and create better connections with their former special schools and created resource centers to be able to help regular schools, and also multilingual education in order to provide to all the minority children quality education, because it is not enough to have only lectures in your mother country. You need also quality textbooks and all the same educational materials as those students from the general population. Since this is a brief presentation, here are just a couple of slides where you can see how some countries covered some of those issues and good policies and practices. In more details, you can find in the whole report and in their policy briefs. So I will just now go through this very quickly and leave time if you have any questions.
Thank you very, very much, Ivana, for that fantastic presentation on equity in education and the barriers that students are facing from multiple countries in achieving equity in education. Now, the chat is open. Please put your questions in the chat so that Ivana can answer your questions. So give people time to type their questions in the chat. Okay, no questions are coming up just now. Does anybody have any comments or reflections on the presentation? Does anybody want any clarity or anything? Or for Ivana to expand on some of the points that she was discussing throughout the presentation? Okay, thank you so much. I think what we'll do is we'll just move on and we'll have an overall discussion afterwards between with all the participants present. Okay, so can we move on to our second presentation, which is from Lana Jurko from the Network of Education Policy Centre. Lana, are you ready to present your presentation? And it's going to be on all means all, inclusion in education. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon, everybody, and great to be here to present this for us a very important report in our network, but I believe for the whole region that the KICS conference is also covering a crucial report for policymakers and any practitioners working on the issues of inclusion and education. I had a few comments for Ivana because in a way, what this report says is really confirmed for the 7 countries that they were working with because they did probably a little bit in-depth study, but most of their findings and conclusions are definitely reflected in this report as well. So my presentation is from the Global Education Monitoring Report that in 2020 came out under the UNESCO flagship, which is yearly report that covers different aspects of policy and education. And we were really pleased that as a follow-up of this global report, UNESCO decided to do a regional report for Central and Eastern Europe, Caucasus, and Central Asia. And this report was then actually completed by 3 organizations, the UNESCO GEM team, the European Agency for Special Needs and Inclusion, and by our own network of education policy centers. So I will go into the presentation mode and I will take you through some findings and recommendations from the report. So when we talk about the region, it is quite a vast geographical region. And if you look, it covers all these countries. So altogether, we managed to cover 30 out of 31 countries that are actually in the region. And we only didn't manage to get data from Turkmenistan. All other countries are covered, and detailed national profiles on laws and policies on inclusion in education can be found on the peer website, and you can see for each country quite the detailed reports. What the report starts from is from this slogan of all means all, where we try to see learner diversity as a strength. Not only to be celebrated, but to be to really strengthen our societies and lead us into social inclusion, and not as a challenge that needs to be overcome. Of course, in getting to this point, there are a lot of challenges in the system, and this little shows you when we say all means all, that there is actually every single child then in a school can be at one point a vulnerable child or child who needs diverse attention or special attention to them. And I really like this little last person waving at us and saying hi, because the only actual issue that he has is that he just arrived to this school. So when we look at diversity, it's not only the socioeconomic, the special education needs, the different ethnic or minority language, but it is all of that as well. But it could be many, many different things. And all of us in some situations in life are the other. So I think we really need to really understand this all means all, that it really means all. Going through some good things in the region, progress has been made towards a right-based approach to inclusive education over the last 20 years. Out-of-school rates fell by half over the past 20 years. And the percentage of children who are with disabilities in special schools fell from 78% in the 10 years to 53% for the years that you see, 2005. I'm sorry, I went back too quickly. Trying to, still not used to this online things. Just 1 second, please. So yes, although progress has been made, and it is the region where actually we had quite big access even before this 20 years. So access has always been high in the region, and this actually quite a dramatic progress is something to celebrate. The percentage of children also in residential institutions fell by 30% for the same period. However, education opportunities are still unequally distributed. And just to point out to some of this data, I won't go through all of that. For example, in Mongolia, 94% of the richest, but only 37% of the poorest complete secondary school. And if we looked at Ivana's results on the same in a region slightly more to the west, we still have similar problems. We also have issue in the region with Roma, Ashkali, and Egyptian youths, especially in the Balkans, but also in Eastern Europe. And in the Balkans, only 60% of them, 60% do not attend upper school, secondary school. And in Montenegro, only 3% completed. So it's really quite a drastic result. And if we look at in Central and Eastern Europe, 1 in 3 students with special education needs are still in special schools. Turkey, on the other hand, did a great effort with the refugee, and they have received huge number, 100,000, and they received them into public school, but still 37% are not in school. So 37% of the refugees in Turkey are not in school. So although progress has been made and a lot of activities for all these groups here have been done, we are still not even close to real equity or real inclusion. So some of the recommendations from the report, I will go straight into them because there is a lot of data, but to give you something concrete, one that really is a concern for the region is the way we collect data and for what we use this data. How we collect it is a third problem. So when you look at the systems, there's a lot of data available. So on school level, all the way to ministry level, data is collected about many different aspects of students. What the problem is that it's only used for resources in the sense of where the money goes, but we don't have this idea that it's also about experience of learners and monitoring of how their life in school is and what it actually means. And also what we often do by collecting data is it becomes a labeling and stigmatization, because when we collect data at school level directly from students, and everybody in the in the classroom or in the school is aware of this, it can lead to bad things. So what the main recommendation is, collect data at system level on these types of issues, but on school level, it's really important to monitor experience of students. So this is like a main suggestion for the region. This third thing that we need to really do is widen the understanding of inclusive education, which should include, of course, all learners. And when we look at the systems, 2 in 3 countries' definition of inclusion embraces multiple marginalized groups, but 2 in 3 countries' definition of special education needs is also linked primarily with disability. So although the policies are widening in its understanding, when we talk to even teachers and let alone general public, when we talk about inclusion, it's always seen as inclusion of special education needs students into mainstreaming, and that's where we stop with the understanding. So this widening of understanding of everybody is also a key. And as I said, we need really to focus on students. Inclusion is an experience, not just the result. So it's really about them and how they feel in school. Unfortunately, 2 out of 10 of students in our region feel like outsiders in their own schools. So that's 20%, around 20% of kids who feel that they don't belong in school, which is quite striking. Of course, this is also about the right to be in good physical and mental health, happy and connected with others, which is just as important as the right to learn, and I would say more important than achievements, which is something that the systems do monitor. Schools are a key environment for the development of children's well-being, specifically for vulnerable groups, even more so. It could be their only place of security and safety, and they need to be safe havens for all students. And the sense of belonging, as I said, is really vital for vulnerable learners. Another thing that is definitely a problem in our region is this exchanging, so bridging gaps between policies and practice. We heard from Ivana also about where the problem starts when we start having good policies, but lack of implementation. She talked about lack of enforcement mechanisms and invested time. But there is also lack of cooperation between different groups in the system. We have this real disconnection from policy and school and classroom practice realities. So this is something that we really need to cover as international organizations. I think one of the things that we often do is we look at policy and we forget to look at the implementation. So on policy level, and I would say this is one of the issues with European policies on EU level, where policies really look fine, but we do know that kids in schools are not that well. And then when we look at how policies are moving towards inclusive education, there are in 21 out of 30 countries actually strategies for this. So we hope that things will move further. So as I said, also this collaboration is crucial. We have a few good examples where in Lithuania, interministerial work helps children. There is connection on horizontal collaboration between different ministries, which is crucial, but there should also be much more cooperation with non-government sector practitioners and governments. So we also know that we really need in-school support for students. And if you look at these numbers, there seems to be quite a lot of things going on, much more counseling, learning assistance, special therapists in all of these countries. What is the problem is that we often with this type of approach target support, which is really doesn't serve inclusion always to the best. Using special schools as a potential resource is also a way forward. We've now heard that North Macedonia is doing it from Ivana, but also Poland moving very quickly towards that. Participation as general is also quite a big problem in the countries. Participation in policy making is something that is still not a cultural thing that is normally happening in our region. Mostly it's about consultation, so minimal law requirements are done, but seeing parents or others as equal partners in policy making is still a problem. We do have, of course, some good example. And in governance of schools, not only parents, but also students through different mechanisms like the parents' councils or students' councils are being heard. However, even that in many cases is just pro forma. So we have a body, but we don't know how we select people into these bodies, and we don't know what their rights are. And often it just stands to have one meeting a year, and that's it. So involvement of parents and students should be also a priority. When we talk about content and the school materials, we really need to move there. We've seen from also Ivana's presentation that this is one of the barriers. We have specific problems with, I would say, three groups: gender, LGBTI, and Roma. We do have some positive cases. For example, in Azerbaijan, review textbooks for gender equity criteria has been introduced. On the other hand, in Turkey, gender topics were taken out of the curriculum that were already there. So we're going back instead of going forward. LGBTI are totally invisible. In some countries, you cannot even mention LGBTI in school. For example, in Russian Federation, it's against the law. And then we have a big problem of Roma visibility in curriculum. 9 countries out of, so that we're talking this region. In Romania, there has been a recent move where a comprehensive framing of Roma history was introduced. Representation in textbooks and other learning materials and in the curriculum is weak at the moment for some groups, and it should be something that we need to work on. And of course, not to forget assessment, adapted assessment for different groups is really needed. And I would say formative assessment is something that we need to really move from in the region quite quickly. And then we have different types of curricula for also, for example, mainstream schools for ethnic groups. And although, of course, a goal is that ethnic minorities have a right to be educated in the minority language and so on, unfortunately, when you separate them in different schools, which is case in 22 out of 30 countries, you also in a way segregate, and it's not about inclusion. However, we have an example in Slovenia of a bilingual schools where ethnic and majority and minority learn together using an intercultural curriculum, which could be a move towards. We need to be flexible. Also, some groups, for example, we have excellent examples of mobile schools in Mongolia, Uzbekistan, Russian Federation, and Kazakhstan for the nomadic population, which is something that is a very nice or good way to actually include those who are not even in the same place all the time. Teachers, what to say? Of course, we all know teachers are the most important chain in our chain of education. They need to be prepared. All teachers need to be prepared to teach all students. It's very often not the core part of initial teacher education. And we really need to make inclusion as a paradigm of teacher education, which is not at the moment. So in-service is trying, or professional development is trying to catch up of what has not been covered in their pre-service training. Some good examples there. In Hungary, we have actually schools or universities, teacher faculties, which work very closely with schools who implement inclusion. So those student teachers are already involved in practice while they're studying. We need to have competencies in inclusion as part of licensing and certification. More diversity among teachers. Most teachers in the region are #1 female, number 2 from majority group. So having some kind of diversity among teacher workforce would also be a good move. Support personnel, although you saw in many countries we have different support, whether it's teaching assistants, psychologists, pedagogues, and so on in schools. We don't have them in all schools. Often they're lacking in the system, and their roles are not clearly defined. And I know I have to finish, Andie. I will be done in 1 minute. I'm sorry about that. What the problem with this type of personnel in school is that they often are assigned administrative roles, which should not be their roles. Just to close, COVID has made things worse. In many cases, you see the numbers here. I won't go into details, but we need to really see the pandemic as really a mirror of the society and the education system as it was. It was not good before the pandemic. Pandemic only made it worse. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that, Lana. That was a fantastic presentation. Thank you so much. I'm just checking the chat. There has been no questions put in the chat just now. I think what the best thing to do is just to have the third speaker come forward, and then we'll have a general discussion at the end. Okay, so can I invite please the third speaker, which is Sergiy Londar, if you are ready. Fantastic. Okay, Sergiy, over to you.
Dear colleagues, Let me start by thanking the organizer of the first Education Policy and Innovation Conference for bringing us together. I also thank you for the opportunity to present my report on the development of inclusive education in Ukraine. Inclusive education in Ukraine began to develop intensively only recently, just a few years ago. The institutional framework within which inclusive education is being developed has international legal framework and national legal aspects. Okay. Stopped. I don't understand.
Hello, so I am controlling the slides here. So whenever you tell me to go next, I will go ahead and do next.
Please, да, переведите, пожалуйста, слайды.
Yes, please switch the slide. Please move to the next slide.
Legal aspects for inclusive education. Due to the shortage of time, I will not dwell on the details of legal regulation, but I'd like to point that Ukraine is currently developing a national strategy for the development of inclusive education for a 10-year period. Please slide next slide. Slide 4 shows that inclusive education in a Ukrainian school has received a significant boost in development since 2016. Over the past 5 years, the number of students participating in inclusive education increases almost 6 times. The number of inclusive classes increases almost 7 times, and the number of teachers' assistants increased almost 9 times. Next slide. On slide 5, you can see a spectrum of nosologies as well as the spectrum of diseases and the distribution of the number of Ukrainian students by these diseases. Given that the range of diseases among students is wide enough, the task of introducing and ensuring effective inclusive education in school is very difficult for educational managers, as it contains many challenges. I'd like to stress that the intensive development of inclusive education took place in parallel with the course of the national educational reform, New Ukrainian School, which began in 2016. As part of this reform, the emphasis on the relationship between hard skills and soft skills in Ukrainian school education has been revised. Approaches to teaching students with special educational needs were also reviewed. The Ministry of Education and Science of Ukraine has developed new approaches for the inclusion of such students in normal school life. Previously, such education was mainly in special education institutions. For the development of inclusion, since 2017, government has also created a new budget instrument. Every year from the state budget, a special subvention is given to local budget as a state support to persons with special educational needs. Slide 6. Next slide. You can see growth dynamics of these funds from slide 6. And the principle of money follows the students is implemented in the field of inclusive education. For the allocated budget funds during 2017-2021, a network of classes was developed in which a student or several students receive an inclusive education. Also, there are teachers' assistants who help such students. The characteristics of this network are presented in the next slide 7. And slide 8. Please return. I will not dwell on these details due to the shortage of time, but presentation material will be available to everyone, and you can investigate the details if necessary. I'd like to consider in more detail the issues ensuring the reliable functioning of the inclusive education network, the creation of effective management of school inclusion. As part of this of such management, inclusive resource centers have been established in every region of Ukraine. Next slide, please. Next slide. No, return, please. Return. Oh. At the end of 2020, there were a total of 627 inclusive resource centers in Ukraine. Today, these centers carry out consultative and organizational work with parents, students with special educational needs, teachers, provide organizational and qualified methodological support for inclusive education. Their main functions are conducting a comprehensive assessment to determine the special educational needs of the child, developing recommendations for the curriculum, providing psychological and pedagogical assistance for children with special educational needs, advising and collaborating with teachers in preschool, general secondary education, and vocational institutions on the organization of inclusive education, providing counseling and psychological support to parents, keeping accounting records concerning the payment of educational services for particular child. In other words, inclusive resource centers processes documents concerning the nosology of a particular student, as well as documents relating to the finances of given students' education. In order to ensure the systematic operation in inclusive resource centers, automate their work and provide inclusive education at the local level, and information education system, automation system of inclusive resource center, ISC, has been created in Ukraine. Our Institute of Educational Analytics, was involved by the Ministry of Education and Science of Ukraine to develop a technical task for the creation of this information system. I have added that in the course of our work, we have also studied the experience of the functioning of such information system in European countries. School specificities in Ukraine were also taken into account. Today, the information system ISIC has been functioning for 3 years. This information system carries out operational analytical control of the inclusive resource center activities in real time, provides its user with online access to the central database of accounting logs, of applications and conclusions on the examination of children. The system uses specialized technology for administration of access rights and roles, as well as standardized hierarchy of territorial and administrative subordination of institutions. The main function, next slide. The main function of the ISIC include creation of evidence information base for management decision in the field of inclusive education, ensuring comprehensive protection of information in accordance with the requirements of the legislation, including personal data from unauthorized access and the limitation of access to information stored and processed, ensuring the functioning of electronic list of specialist property visitors to inclusive resource center, providing electronic document management of the inclusive education system, obtaining, processing, and generating information produced in the statements and conclusions of a comprehensive assessment, individual child development programs, ensuring the functioning of the electronic list of inclusive resource centers, information and telecommunication support for the activities of inclusive resource centers. The information system ISIC has relevant information protection mechanism and obligated state certificate of the State Information Protection Service. The operation of the information system decreases several times the number of face-to-face visits of parents. Since 2020, a mobile, next slide, please. Since 2020, a mobile applications for the ISIC has been created. It is available to anyone who has a Play Market or the App Store on their gadget. This was especially useful during the quarantine. Thanks to such organization support, the education of children with special needs did not stop. I'd like to conclude my statement by saying that, next slide, please. In Ukraine, a number of measures for being taken to develop inclusive education in the context of ensuring the right of every person to access quality education. The draft national strategy for the development of inclusive education in Ukraine for a 10-year period, 2021-2031, is currently being developed. The strategy envisages the further gradual reduction of the network of special education institutions and the parallel development of the network of inclusive classes in regular schools. It is planned to modernize schools with inclusive classes, improve methodological support using international achievements, and use modern pedagogical methods. Continuing training for teachers, assistants who work directly with students with special educational needs is also envisaged. The implementation of this task will be carried out at the expense of financial resources of the state and local budgets. The participation of various donors is also welcome. While developing inclusive education in Ukraine, information and analytical support of inclusive education by information education system, ISIC will be further improved to make sound management decisions. Next slide, please. And this is our invitation for cooperation. The Institute of Education Analytics has professional journal, Education Analytics of Ukraine, and we will be glad to obtain your manuscripts. And we are organizers of the International Scientific and Practical Conference, Education Reform in Ukraine, Information and Analytical Support. The deadline for material submission from international participants is October 21. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Sergiy, for that absolutely illuminating presentation on the development of inclusive education in the Ukraine. Okay, if we could stop sharing the screen, thank you. What I would like to do is I'd like to open up now for questions for all three of our presenters. So we can use the chat function, that would be best, but also if people want to raise their hands, we can also use that function as well. So it's whatever you feel comfortable in doing. So if you have any questions for our three presenters, or if you have a general question that maybe links 1, 2, or even 3 of the presentations. Okay, we have a question in the chat. Can that be translated?
Okay. Already done.
Okay, so I've got a question here. How is it possible to enter the IRC portal? We have children and we want to take your experience. So how is it possible to enter the IRC portal? Who would like to answer that question?
I think the question is for Sergiy, no?
I think so.
Да,
Yes.
I'd like to speak Russian in discussion.
Genia.
Да.
So I'm going to speak Russian. So our portal, the IRC portal, is accessible to all. And as I said, it includes a mobile app for those who have Android or App Store gadgets. There's no problem for them to download the app and check out our portal. So we'll include a link. Please write to the Institute of Education and Analytics. Write to us by email and we'll help you. If you're not able to find it yourself.
Also another question for you in the chat. If you would like to respond to the question in the chat from Zarema.
Да, мы дадим ссылку. Я вот
Yes, we'll write the link right after. I'll send it to you right after our conversation.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions for any of our panelists? Sorry, any of our presenters?
Maybe I don't have a question. I'm tired about inclusive education that I'm the most tired of, but I am really tired of this narrow understanding of inclusion. It's been there for 20 years. We've been trying to promote this inclusive, wholesome understanding of inclusion for many, many years. And I'm really tired of hearing it, especially from educators. So I think by now, teachers in schools, different educators should be aware that inclusion is a much wider concept.
Thanks for that, Lana. Would anybody like to comment on that and to add to the discussion? Okay, come forward. Okay, Lana, I think we've got some questions in the chat for you, okay? Are you quite happy for me to read them out? Okay, the first one is concerning LGBTI. How big is such a population in the school life and what support do they need? Okay, roles of support personnel and perhaps also their interaction and collaboration with subject teachers. Would you like to answer that question?
Okay, about the scope of LGBTI in school life, they're just as large as they are in general population. Which I think, according to some data, which I'm not completely sure about, but it's around 7 to 10% of the population. What support they need? First, they need to be visible in the sense of there needs to be content about them. They need to be accepted, their lifestyles. We are not only talking about students who are LGBTI, but those who come from families that are LGBTI. So rainbow families as a family that exists in our societies should be recognized, and that will help them greatly. They might need support in the sense of psychosocial support in challenges they face, especially in their teenage years, I would say. We have some really good examples in particular schools that do such programs where this is a topic that is open, that is discussed, and I think that would be a first step. But there is, of course, much more. About the roles of support personnel, yeah, unfortunately, a lot happens where the support personnel are seen as a separate part of the school, so not integrated, not only with subject teachers, but also with teachers in school, in class teachers as well. The roles tend to be administrative. Very often the pedagogue in school, which is a classical, I think in all your countries, you probably also have pedagogues. They're seen as like a extension of a school leader or a school director. They do a lot of administration and are burdened with a lot of administration rather than learning and teaching issues. So yeah, that would be the main problems.
Okay, thank you so much for that, Lana. That was a really thorough response to that question. We also have a question for Sergiy again. It's from the same person. Are these centres parts of schools or separate institutions? So when you're talking about these inclusive centres, are they actually part of the schools or are they separate institutions?
Нет, это отдельные.
These are separate centers with which are created in each region of Ukraine. And as I said, there are 667 by the end of 2020 all over Ukraine.
Родители,
And they provide consultative support for methodology, support for parents who need assistance. They determine which school the children should go to. So these central educational departments, which is in charge of education of the region, but they exist as a separate organization. They're not part of the schools.
Okay, thank you, Sergiy. There's also, I'm not sure if you've actually answered this question, but who does the systems report to? Okay, so for example, the reporting process of these centres and the systems, who do they actually report to? So where does the information go?
Информация.
So information from all of the information about all of the students who are part of inclusive classes is collected in a information system, a database on the central level of Ukraine. It's systemized, and an information space has been created where there's a database of all the students studying as a part of inclusive education. And this information is used by all, including inclusive centers of inclusivity, which studies the needs of a particular child and chooses which school the child should go to. Also parents and teachers, and there's a ton of information which supports the area of inclusive education.
Thank you so much for that. Okay, do we have any other questions for our three presenters? Please feel free to use your hand and come on with your mic if you prefer to do it that way and not use the chat.
Может быть, я тогда задам вопрос. Я еще хотела повторить мой
Maybe I
вопрос, который...
can ask a question. This is a question I asked at the very beginning. I would like to hear the opinion of Sergiy and also our first presenter. What question related to inclusive education you are tired of hearing? Lana has partially answered this question, but I'd like to hear from Sergiy as well. So what question are you tired of hearing and you'd like to not hear in the future anymore? Well, there are questions of funding. There are questions of instruction, methodology, and psychological support, and so forth. Regarding funding, the government of Ukraine has invented and created a new financial instrument, which is a subsidy for inclusivity. And so from the state budget, funds are earmarked for local budgets, and the principle is that money follows the student. So this allows money to reach a particular student, and the student will have this resource. And so, all problems aren't resolved, and there are many problems to deal with, but the central information system, the database, which systematizes all the information, is accessible to the Ministry of Education and local managers, education managers at the oblast level, and to teachers, school teachers, and so forth. And so there's a two-way information exchange. Schools say what they need, what support they need, and this information is analyzed, and then somehow the situation is corrected, is addressed. That's how it works currently. As for the other aspects of the question, there are many questions about inclusivity. We've only been working on this for 6 years, and part of the specialized schools where all these children were gathered together, the number of these schools is decreasing. And what is good is that children are now going to regular schools, even despite their disabilities. And this is the kind of this is the main trend here. Students are leaving these specialized schools for children with special needs and entering regular schools. I think we have roughly 40% of children who are still receiving education in specialized schools. About 60% are included in regular schools, and this process is continuing further. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sergiy. If no one has any questions, I've actually got a question for Lana, if that's okay. Lana, you talked about the the intercultural kind of curriculum that went on in Slovenia, and you seem to be quite enthusiastic about that curriculum, and obviously about bilingual schools. Could you tell us a bit more about what you think is so successful with that model, if that's okay?
Thank you, Andie. The example we used from Slovenia, so the way things work there is, and actually when comparing to other systems, so we traditionally have had schools for ethnic minorities. The idea behind that is, of course, preserving mother tongue, history, culture, and so on, which we cannot say is wrong. Unfortunately, in implementation, what happens, that means that kids from one ethnicity go to one school, and then majority kids go to, and sometimes this is a majority, on national level, it's a minority, but in the region, it might be a majority. The problem we have there is that then they don't learn about each other. So very often the majority kids going to a school next door actually know nothing about the culture, language, history of the minority which lives next door. And also there is no connection between these two groups of children, and this does not serve social inclusion for sure. When we did a study on the differences in these schools, you see that even their civic engagement of the kids going to minority school is much lower. So their engagement in the social life of the country is minor or minorized at least. So what is the good thing in the Slovenian example is that it's one school. Both of them are learning according to the same curricular, which teaches them about each other. And they have classes in both languages. So my one subject might be in Hungarian, the other one would be in Slovenian, and so on. Yeah, so we find that a much better way of actually preserving the culture, history, and language of the minority, and yet working towards inclusion.
Thank you so much for that. That's fantastic and really, really interesting to hear. Do we have any questions before we wrap up?
У меня есть еще раз, может быть, вопрос. Вот как раз
Maybe a question. So in this approach that you mentioned, what would you recommend to teachers to carry out this this bilingual instruction? This is a real challenge for teachers to switch between languages. Can you share experience in this regard?
Well, I'm not sure that I can give you a complete picture, but we have a case study on it, which we can share with you to read. But what I would say is that it's not necessarily that the teacher teaches in both languages. You could have two teachers. But multilingualism, of course, is a challenge everywhere. It's not only a challenge for our region, it's a challenge everywhere in the world. Understanding of multilingualism in a school is a specific topic which is only part of inclusion practices. I think what I would really like to share as a message, of course, teachers find it hard to teach students who don't speak the language of instruction. But as a number one beginning, this recognizing the value of a minority language or of a language that the child speaks, regardless if it's not the language of instruction, is really key for the identity of that child and for them feeling like they belong in the classroom. So I don't have an answer for you how the teachers handle it. And I think in Slovenia, it might be that there are two different teachers. I'm not completely sure. But yeah, I think this recognition of a language, any language, and not only the power languages. So we recognize English or French as a language that everybody should know, but language, any language is an asset, and this is something that teachers really need to embrace.
Okay, thank you so much again, Lana. Do we have any final questions? We have some time left. Amazing insights into inclusive education practices across the globe and how these are impacting on policy and beyond. Just want to say thank you all for participating and thank you so much for coming to this session. It has been an absolute pleasure, okay? And I wish you all the best in enjoying the rest of the conference over the next 2 weeks, okay? Thank you so much.
И вам спасибо. Всего наилучшего.
And thank you as well. Wish you the best. I wish you good health and love and success in your work.
Спасибо большое. Вам тоже, Сергей.
Thank you very much. You too, Sergiy.
Познакомиться с вами.
I was pleased to meet you, and we invite you to cooperate. We can publish your articles and participate in projects together. So thank you very much for inviting us to this event. We were happy to see you, and I wish you the best. Wish you the best too. Goodbye.
Thank you, everybody.